The morning sun cast long shadows across the training compound, as Commander Jake Mitchell watched his elite team prepare for what they believed would be another routine exercise. The Navy SEALs of Team 7 had earned their reputation through countless successful missions in the most dangerous corners of the world. They moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine, each member knowing exactly what the others would do before they did it. Mitchell had been leading this particular group for 3 years, and in that time, they had never failed a mission. Whether it was hostage rescue in hostile territory, reconnaissance behind enemy lines, or direct action against high-value targets, Team 7 always found a way to complete their objectives. The men under his command were the best of the best, hand-picked from thousands of candidates who had already proven themselves worthy of wearing the SEAL trident. The team consisted of 6 highly trained operators, each with their own specialty. There was Rodriguez, the explosives expert who could turn everyday items into devastating weapons. Thompson handled communications and electronic warfare, capable of hacking into enemy systems or jamming their signals from miles away. Davis was their sniper, able to make impossible shots in the worst conditions. Williams served as the medic, though his combat skills rivaled any of the others. Finally, there was Peterson, the demolition specialist who could breach any door or wall in seconds. Today's exercise was supposed to be different from their usual training. Instead of facing other military units or practicing against simulated enemies, they had been told they would be going up against a new type of opponent. The briefing had been deliberately vague, with their commanding officer simply stating that they would be tested by someone who had been brought in, specifically to challenge their capabilities. The SEALs had laughed at the suggestion that anyone could pose a real challenge to their abilities. They had faced the best special forces units from around the world in training exercises and had consistently emerged victorious. Elite troops from the British SAS, German GSG-9, and Israeli Sayeret Matkal had all tried to outmaneuver Team 7, only to find themselves outgunned, outthought, and outmaneuvered at every turn. As they gathered their gear and checked their weapons for the 3rd time that morning, the conversation inevitably turned to speculation about their mysterious opponent. Rodriguez suggested it might be a new AI-controlled drone system that the military was testing. Thompson thought it could be a cyber warfare specialist who would try to disable their equipment remotely. Davis wondered if they were going up against another SEAL team that had been training in secret. Mitchell listened to their theories with amusement, but said nothing. He had received slightly more information than his men, though not much. All he knew was that their opponent was a single individual who had supposedly developed new tactics that could neutralize even the most elite military units. The idea seemed absurd to him, but orders were orders, and he trusted that his superiors had their reasons for arranging this exercise. The training area had been set up to simulate an urban environment, complete with multi-story buildings, narrow alleyways, and various obstacles that would provide both cover and potential ambush points. It was the type of terrain where Team 7 excelled, having spent countless hours perfecting their room-clearing techniques and urban warfare tactics. The buildings were equipped with sensors that would register hits from their training ammunition, making the exercise as realistic as possible without actual casualties. As the team moved toward the starting position, Mitchell noticed something unusual about the setup. There were cameras positioned at various points throughout the training area, far more than were typically used for standard exercises. Additionally, several senior officers had gathered in the observation area, including some faces he didn't recognize. Whatever was about to happen, it was clearly being taken very seriously by the higher-ups. The radio crackled to life with instructions from the exercise controller. Team 7 was to enter the training area and secure 3 objectives within a 2-hour time limit. They would face opposition from an unknown enemy, who would attempt to prevent them from completing their mission. The rules of engagement were standard for training exercises, with electronic sensors determining hits and casualties. Mitchell gathered his team for a final briefing before they entered the exercise area. He assigned specific roles to each member and outlined their approach. They would enter from the east side of the compound, move systematically through the buildings while clearing each room, and work their way toward the objectives. It was a straightforward plan that played to all of their strengths. As they approached the entry point, the SEALs moved with the fluid grace that came from years of training together. They communicated through hand signals and brief radio transmissions, coordinating their movements with the precision of a ballet. Each man knew exactly where the others were at all times, and they had contingency plans for every possible scenario they might encounter. The first building appeared empty as they began their systematic search. Room by room, they cleared each floor, finding no sign of their mysterious opponent. The silence was almost unnerving, as they had expected to encounter resistance almost immediately. Davis took position on the roof to provide overwatch, while the others continued their advance through the urban maze. It wasn't until they reached the second building that things began to feel wrong. Rodriguez noticed that one of the doors they had already cleared and marked was now slightly ajar, though he was certain it had been closed when they passed through. Thompson reported brief interference with his communications equipment, lasting only seconds but occurring at regular intervals. Williams found fresh boot prints in the dust that definitely hadn't been there when they first surveyed the area. Mitchell began to realize that they weren't just facing an opponent who was hiding from them. Someone was actively tracking their movements, staying one step ahead of their systematic search pattern. Whoever they were up against understood military tactics well enough to predict their next moves and was using that knowledge to remain invisible while gathering intelligence on Team 7's capabilities and procedures. The first real sign of trouble came when Davis lost contact with the team. The sniper had been providing overwatch from a rooftop position when his radio suddenly went silent. Mitchell tried to raise him on multiple frequencies, but there was no response. According to the electronic sensors built into their training gear, Davis was still alive and operational, but he wasn't answering any calls. Thompson immediately began scanning for electronic interference that might be blocking their communications, but his equipment showed nothing unusual. The radio signals were clear, and there was no indication of jamming or other electronic warfare tactics being used against them. It was as if Davis had simply vanished into thin air, though his tracking beacon continued to show his position on the rooftop. Mitchell made the decision to send Peterson to check on their missing sniper, while the rest of the team continued toward the first objective. It should have been a simple task. Climb to the roof, confirm Davis's status, and report back. Peterson was one of their most experienced operators, and the building had already been cleared twice. There should have been no danger in the assignment. 20 minutes passed before Peterson's voice came through their radios, and what he reported made no sense to any of them. He had found Davis unconscious on the rooftop, apparently taken down by some kind of non-lethal weapon that had left no obvious marks or injuries. The sniper's gear was undisturbed, his weapon was still in position, and there were no signs of a struggle. It was as if he had simply fallen asleep while on duty, which was impossible for someone of his training and experience. Even more puzzling was the fact that Peterson could find no evidence of how anyone had reached the rooftop without being detected. The building had only 2 access points, the stairwell that Team 7 had used and a fire escape on the opposite side. Both had been under observation, and no one had been seen approaching or leaving the building. Yet somehow, their mysterious opponent had managed to neutralize one of the most alert and capable soldiers in the entire unit. Rodriguez suggested that they might be dealing with someone using advanced camouflage technology, possibly some kind of experimental stealth suit that could make a person nearly invisible. Thompson countered that even the most advanced camouflage couldn't hide heat signatures or movement from someone as skilled as Davis. Williams wondered if they were facing multiple opponents who were coordinating their attacks in ways that made them appear to be a single person. Mitchell ordered the team to regroup and reassess their situation. Whatever they were up against was far more sophisticated than they had initially believed. The fact that Davis had been taken down without raising an alarm suggested that their opponent possessed skills that went beyond conventional military training. This was clearly not going to be the routine exercise they had expected. As they moved toward a more defensible position, the team began to notice other subtle signs that they were being watched and analyzed. Small items in rooms they had cleared were moved or rearranged, though nothing obvious enough to be spotted immediately. Their radio frequencies were being monitored, as evidenced by the fact that their opponent seemed to anticipate their movements, even when they changed their plans at the last minute. The second incident occurred when Williams went to check on Peterson, who had remained with the unconscious Davis. When the medic reached the rooftop, he found Peterson in the same condition as the sniper, unconscious but unharmed. with no indication of what had happened to him. Two of their most capable operators had been neutralized without firing a shot, or even seeing their attacker. This time, Williams was more observant and noticed something that the others had missed. There was a faint chemical smell in the air near where both men had fallen, suggesting that some kind of gas or aerosol had been used to render them unconscious. However, he couldn't determine how the substance had been delivered. As there were no visible devices or containers anywhere on the rooftop, the remaining 3 members of Team 7 found themselves in a situation they had never encountered before. They were being systematically picked off by an opponent they couldn't see, hear, or detect through any of their normal methods. Their training had prepared them for many different scenarios, but nothing in their experience had prepared them for this kind of psychological warfare. Mitchell realized that their standard tactics were not only ineffective but were actually working against them. Their predictable movement patterns and communication protocols were being used by their opponent to stay ahead of their actions. Whoever they were facing had studied military tactics extensively and understood how elite units like the SEALs operated under pressure. The commander made the difficult decision to abandon their original mission, objectives, and focus entirely on identifying and engaging their mysterious adversary. They would need to throw out everything they had been trained to do and improvise new tactics that couldn't be predicted or countered. It was a humbling moment for soldiers who had never faced a challenge they couldn't overcome through superior firepower and training. Rodriguez suggested that they split up and approach the problem from multiple directions, but Mitchell rejected the idea immediately. Their opponent had already demonstrated an ability to isolate and neutralize individual team members. Staying together was their only hope of avoiding the same fate as Davis and Peterson. Thompson proposed using his electronic warfare equipment to flood the area with signal interference, hoping to disrupt whatever technology their opponent might be using to track their movements. It was a desperate measure that would also interfere with their own communications, but at this point, they were willing to try anything that might level the playing field. As they prepared to implement their new strategy, a voice came through their radio system, clear, calm, and completely unexpected. It was a woman's voice, speaking with the confidence of someone who had been listening to their conversations and watching their every move. She introduced herself simply as Harper and suggested that they might want to reconsider their approach to the exercise. Harper's voice cut through their radio chatter with an unsettling clarity that made the remaining SEALs freeze in their positions. She spoke as if she were sitting right beside them, yet they had no idea where she was or how she had accessed their secure communication channel. The encryption on their radios was military grade, supposedly impossible to crack without specialized equipment and considerable time. "Gentlemen," Harper continued, her tone almost conversational, "you're approaching this all wrong. You're still thinking like hunters when you should be thinking like prey. 2 of your teammates are sleeping peacefully on that rooftop, and they'll wake up with nothing worse than slight headaches. But if you keep moving in those predictable patterns, I'll have to put the rest of you down before you reach any of your objectives." Mitchell felt his jaw clench as he realized the implications of what she was saying. Not only had this woman somehow infiltrated their communications, but she was treating the exercise like a game, where she held all the advantages. The fact that she knew exactly how many team members he had left meant she had been tracking them constantly since the beginning of the exercise. Thompson immediately began working to trace the source of the transmission, but his equipment showed that the signal was coming from multiple locations simultaneously. Somehow, Harper was bouncing her communications through several relay points, making it impossible to pinpoint her actual position. The level of technical sophistication required for such a setup suggested military or intelligence agency training. Rodriguez whispered that they should ignore the psychological warfare and stick to their mission. But Mitchell wasn't so sure. Everything about this situation suggested that they were dealing with someone who understood their capabilities better than they understood hers. The woman had already proven that she could neutralize experienced operators without them even knowing she was there. Harper seemed to sense their hesitation because she spoke again, this time with a hint of amusement in her voice. "I know what you're thinking, Commander Mitchell. You're wondering how a single person could possibly have this much of an advantage over your elite team. The answer is simple. I wrote the book on countering special operations tactics, literally. Your playbook is my playbook, except I know all the weaknesses you haven't discovered yet." The claim seemed impossible, But the evidence was mounting that Harper possessed knowledge and skills that went far beyond what any single individual should have been able to acquire. She had demonstrated mastery of stealth techniques, electronic warfare, chemical weapons delivery, and psychological operations, all within the span of an hour. Either she was the most gifted soldier any of them had ever encountered, or she had access to resources and technology that weren't available to conventional military units. Williams suggested that Harper might be using some kind of remote-controlled system, possibly drones or robotic devices that could explain how she seemed to be in multiple places at once. The idea had merit, but it didn't explain how she had managed to get close enough to Davis and Peterson to render them unconscious without being detected by their advanced sensors and training. As if reading their minds, Harper's voice came through the radio again with an offer that caught them completely off guard. "I'll tell you what, gentlemen. I'm going to give you a chance to even the odds. In exactly 10 minutes, I'm going to reveal my position to you. You'll have a brief window to engage me directly, one-on-one. If you can take me down during that window, your unconscious teammates will wake up, and you can complete your mission objectives." Mitchell immediately suspected a trap, but he also recognized that they were running out of options. Their current approach was clearly not working, and Harper had already demonstrated that she could pick them off one by one whenever she chose. At least a direct confrontation would give them a chance to use their superior numbers and firepower to their advantage. Thompson raised the obvious, concerned that Harper's offer might be designed to lure them into an ambush where she could neutralize all three remaining team members simultaneously. However, Rodriguez pointed out that she could probably accomplish the same result using her current tactics, so the offer might actually represent their best opportunity to turn the tables. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness as the three SEALs tried to position themselves for whatever Harper had planned. They spread out to cover multiple approach routes while maintaining visual contact with each other. Mitchell kept checking his watch, wondering what kind of surprise awaited them when the 10-minute deadline arrived. When Harper's voice returned to their radios, she provided coordinates that placed her in the central courtyard of the training compound. It was an open area with minimal cover, surrounded by buildings that would provide excellent vantage points for the SEALs to engage her from multiple directions. The location seemed to favor their superior numbers and marksmanship skills. Mitchell led his remaining team toward the courtyard, using hand signals to coordinate their approach. They took positions on three sides of the open area, each man covering a different angle to ensure that Harper couldn't escape without being engaged. Their training ammunition might not be lethal, but the electronic sensors would register hits and determine the outcome of any firefight. As they prepared to advance into the courtyard, Thompson spotted movement near the center of the open space. A single figure stood calmly in the middle of the area, making no attempt to seek cover or concealment. Even from a distance, they could see that it was indeed a woman. Dressed in standard military fatigues but carrying no visible weapons or equipment, Harper appeared to be completely relaxed, as if she were attending a casual meeting, rather than facing three heavily armed special operations soldiers. She raised one hand in what might have been a greeting or signal, then spoke into what appeared to be a small radio clipped to her collar. "Gentlemen, as promised, here I am. You have exactly 2 minutes to take your shot before I disappear again. I should mention that your missing teammates are watching this from the observation deck, along with your commanding officers. This is your chance to salvage some dignity from this exercise." Mitchell felt his finger tighten on the trigger of his weapon as he lined up the shot. From his position, Harper was an easy target, standing motionless in the center of the courtyard with nowhere to run or hide. Rodriguez and Thompson had similar angles from their positions, giving them overlapping fields of fire that would make it impossible for her to avoid being hit. Yet something about the situation felt wrong to the experienced commander. Harper's confidence was absolute, as if she knew something that they didn't. No one would stand so calmly in the open unless they had a plan that the SEALs couldn't see or understand. Mitchell's finger hovered over the trigger as he studied Harper through his weapon's scope. Every instinct told him to take the shot, but something about her absolute calm made him hesitate. In his years of combat experience, he had never seen anyone stand so relaxed when facing multiple armed opponents. She wasn't even wearing body armor that might give her confidence in her ability to survive being hit. Rodriguez wasn't plagued by the same doubts and squeezed his trigger first. The training round should have struck Harper's center mass, but at the last second, She seemed to blur and shift position. The electronic sensor registered a miss, even though Rodriguez was certain his aim had been perfect. He fired again immediately, and once more. Harper seemed to anticipate the shot and moved just enough to avoid being hit. Thompson opened fire from his position, trying to catch Harper as she dodged Rodriguez's shots, but somehow she managed to avoid his rounds as well, moving with a fluid grace that seemed almost supernatural. She wasn't running or diving for cover like a normal person would. Instead, she flowed from one position to another, as if she could predict exactly where each shot would be aimed. Mitchell finally pulled his own trigger, leading Harper's movement and aiming for where she would be rather than where she was. The shot should have been impossible to avoid, but Harper dropped to one knee at precisely the right moment, letting the round pass harmlessly over her head. She then rolled sideways and came up in a new position, somehow avoiding the follow-up shots from all three SEALs. The sustained gunfire continued for nearly a full minute, with all three operators pouring training rounds toward Harper's position. They had practiced this exact scenario countless times, using crossfire patterns that should have made it impossible for any target to survive. Yet Harper continued to move between their shots, never appearing rushed or desperate, simply flowing from one safe position to another. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the engagement ended. Harper raised both hands above her head and called out that the exercise was over. The three SEALs kept their weapons trained on her, expecting some kind of trick, but she remained motionless with her hands clearly visible. After a few moments, Rodriguez cautiously approached to secure the target. What he found when he reached Harper's position defied everything he thought he knew about combat and human capabilities. She wasn't even breathing hard, despite having spent the last minute performing what should have been physically impossible evasive maneuvers. Her equipment was minimal. No body armor, no advanced electronics, just standard military fatigues and a small radio. Thompson arrived next and immediately began checking for hidden devices or technology that might explain Harper's abilities. He found nothing unusual, no advanced systems that could have provided her with superhuman reflexes or precognitive abilities. She appeared to be exactly what she looked like, a single person who had somehow managed to outmaneuver three of the most highly trained soldiers in the world. Mitchell approached last, his weapon still ready but his mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. Harper looked up at him with a slight smile and asked if he was beginning to understand why his team had been selected for this particular exercise. She explained that the military was facing new types of threats that couldn't be countered with traditional tactics and overwhelming firepower. "Your team is very good at what they do," Harper said as she stood and brushed dust from her uniform. "But what you do is based on patterns and procedures that can be studied and countered. Every special operations unit in the world trains using essentially the same methods you use. They move the same way, think the same way, and react the same way to threats." She gestured toward the observation deck where their commanding officers were watching the exercise. "The people up there are worried about enemies who don't follow conventional military doctrine. Terrorists, insurgents, and hostile intelligence agents who have studied our methods and developed countermeasures, specifically designed to neutralize our advantages." Rodriguez interrupted to ask how Harper had managed to avoid their gunfire when she had no cover and nowhere to hide. Her answer was both simple and unsettling. She had studied their training records, learned their shooting patterns, and practiced countering their specific techniques until she could predict their actions before they made them. "Every SEAL team uses the same manual," Harper explained. "You're taught to shoot in specific patterns to coordinate your fire in predictable ways. Once I know which team I'm facing and study their previous exercises, I can anticipate exactly where their shots will go and when they'll fire them. It's not magic, it's just very detailed preparation." Thompson wanted to know how she had accessed their training records and communication systems. Harper's response revealed that she worked for a classified government program that was tasked with identifying weaknesses in military special operations capabilities. Her job was to study elite units like the SEALs and develop methods for hostile forces to counter them. The implications of what she was saying began to sink in for Mitchell and his team. If Harper could neutralize their capabilities so easily, then enemies with access to similar intelligence and training methods could potentially do the same thing. All of their advantages in equipment, training, and coordination could be turned against them by opponents who understood their methods better than they understood themselves. Williams and Peterson arrived from the medical station where they had been treated for their brief unconsciousness. Both men reported feeling fine with no lasting effects from whatever Harper had used to knock them out. Davis joined them from the rooftop, equally unaffected but clearly puzzled by how he had been taken down without warning. Harper gathered the entire team around her and began to explain the purpose of the exercise. The military was facing a new generation of threats from adversaries who had spent years studying American tactics and developing specific countermeasures. These enemies couldn't match the SEALs in terms of equipment or training, but they could potentially neutralize those advantages through superior intelligence and unconventional methods. This exercise wasn't designed to humiliate your team, Harper said, looking each man in the eye. It was designed to open your minds to possibilities you haven't considered before. There are people out there who know everything about how you operate, and they're developing ways to use that knowledge against you. Mitchell asked what they were supposed to do with this information. How could they maintain their effectiveness if their enemies knew all their secrets and had developed specific countermeasures for their tactics? Harper's answer would challenge everything they thought they knew about special operations warfare. Harper's answer came in the form of a proposition that would fundamentally change how Team 7 approached their missions. She explained that the military had established a new training program designed to help elite units adapt to enemies who understood their conventional tactics. The program would teach them to think and operate in completely different ways, abandoning many of the methods they had relied on throughout their careers. The first thing you need to understand, Harper began, is that predictability is your greatest weakness. Every manual you've studied, every procedure you've memorized, every formation you've practiced, all of that information is available to your enemies. They know exactly how Navy SEALs are supposed to respond in any given situation. She led the team to a different section of the training compound, one that had been set up to look like a civilian environment rather than a military target. There were no clear sight lines, no obvious tactical advantages, and no predetermined routes that would favor conventional military approaches. It was the type of environment where their superior firepower and training might actually work against them. Mitchell studied the new terrain and immediately began identifying problems with their standard operating procedures. The narrow spaces and irregular layout would make their usual movement patterns impossible. The presence of simulated civilians would require them to be much more careful about their use of weapons and explosives. Most importantly, the environment would force them to abandon many of their tested tactics and improvise new approaches on the fly. Harper explained that this was exactly the point of the exercise. Modern conflicts increasingly took place in environments where conventional military advantages were minimized or eliminated entirely. Enemies had learned to choose battlegrounds that favored their unconventional methods over superior training and equipment. The SEALs would need to learn how to operate effectively in these disadvantageous conditions. The next several hours were unlike any training the team had ever experienced. Instead of following established procedures, they were encouraged to experiment with completely new approaches. They practiced moving through the environment in ways that contradicted their normal training, communicating through methods that weren't in any manual, and solving problems using techniques they had never been taught. Rodriguez discovered that his explosives expertise was actually a liability in the civilian environment, where collateral damage would be unacceptable, and noise would immediately give away their position. He had to learn to think like a burglar rather than a soldier, finding ways to bypass obstacles without leaving obvious signs of his presence. Thompson found that his sophisticated communication equipment was less useful than simple, low-tech methods that enemies wouldn't be expecting or monitoring. Harper showed him how to pass information using techniques that were nearly impossible to detect or intercept, even by someone who knew what to look for. Davis had to completely rethink his approach to providing overwatch and support. Traditional sniper positions were too obvious and predictable in the civilian environment. He learned to use unexpected vantage points and unconventional shooting positions that would confuse enemies who were expecting him to behave like a trained marksman. Williams discovered that his medical training gave him insights into human behavior and psychology that could be used for intelligence gathering and influence operations. Harper taught him techniques for reading people in situations that went far beyond what he had learned about treating injuries and maintaining physical health. Peterson learned that his demolition skills could be adapted for constructive purposes. creating diversions and false trails that would mislead enemies about the team's actual objectives and capabilities. Instead of using explosives to destroy things, he began thinking about how to use them to manipulate enemy perceptions and responses. Mitchell found the new training methods both fascinating and deeply unsettling. Everything he had learned about leadership and tactical decision-making was being turned upside down. Harper was teaching them to embrace uncertainty and chaos, rather than trying to control every aspect of their operations. It went against every instinct he had developed during his military career. The most difficult part of the new training was learning to think like their enemies rather than like soldiers. Harper explained that conventional military training created predictable thought patterns that hostile intelligence agencies had learned to exploit. To be truly effective against modern threats, the SEALs would need to learn how to think in completely different ways. Your enemies have studied psychology, anthropology, and social engineering, Harper told them during a brief break between exercises. They understand how military units make decisions and how soldiers react under pressure. They use that knowledge to manipulate your responses and lead you into situations where your training works against you. She provided examples from recent conflicts where elite military units had been outmaneuvered by seemingly inferior opponents who understood their tactics better than they understood themselves. In each case, the superior force had been defeated not through direct confrontation but through psychological manipulation and exploitation of their predictable responses. The team began to understand that they were not just learning new tactics but were fundamentally changing how they thought about warfare itself. Instead of trying to overwhelm their enemies with superior force, they would need to learn how to outthink opponents who might be just as intelligent and resourceful as they were. As the training day progressed, Team 7 found themselves becoming more comfortable with uncertainty and improvisation. They began to see their previous reliance on established procedures as a limitation rather than a strength. The realization was both liberating and terrifying, as it meant abandoning many of the certainties that had made them feel invincible. Harper observed their progress with satisfaction, noting how quickly they were adapting to concepts that had taken her years to develop and master. She explained that their willingness to abandon their preconceptions was actually a sign of their elite training. Truly superior soldiers were those who could recognize when their methods needed to change. By the end of the day, Team 7 was operating in ways that bore little resemblance to conventional special operations tactics. They moved unpredictably, communicated in unusual ways, and solved problems using methods that weren't in any manual. Most importantly, they were beginning to think like the unconventional enemies they might face in future conflicts. 3 months after their first encounter with Harper, Team 7 found themselves deployed on a mission that would test everything they had learned. Intelligence reports indicated that a high-value target was hiding in a crowded urban area, protected by a network of supporters who had been specifically trained to counter American special operations tactics. It was exactly the type of scenario that Harper had prepared them for. The enemy they faced was unlike any they had encountered before. Instead of using conventional defensive positions or trying to match the SEALs' firepower, the hostile forces had created a complex web of deception and misdirection. They used the civilian population as cover, not by threatening them, but by blending in so seamlessly that it was impossible to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. Mitchell led his team into the operational area using none of the standard approaches they would have employed in the past. Instead of following predetermined routes or using established communication protocols, they moved unpredictably and adapted their methods constantly. The new techniques Harper had taught them felt strange and uncomfortable, but they were proving effective against enemies who had clearly studied conventional SEAL tactics. Rodriguez found himself thinking like a criminal rather than a soldier, using skills he had never imagined would be part of military operations. Instead of breaching doors with explosives, he picked locks and bypassed security systems using techniques that left no trace of their presence. The approach allowed the team to gather intelligence without alerting their enemies to their location or capabilities. Thompson discovered that his most sophisticated communication equipment was useless against enemies who were monitoring all conventional military frequencies and protocols. Instead, he relied on simple, low-tech methods that Harper had taught him, techniques that were nearly impossible to detect or decode. The enemy's superior intelligence capabilities became irrelevant when there was nothing for them to intercept. Davis found that his traditional sniper training was actually a disadvantage in the complex urban environment. The enemy had identified all the conventional overwatch positions and had set up countermeasures specifically designed to neutralize military marksmen. Instead, he used unexpected vantage points and unconventional shooting techniques that confused enemies who were expecting him to behave. Predictably, Williams applied his medical knowledge in ways he had never considered before, reading the behavioral patterns and stress responses of potential targets to identify which individuals might be combatants in disguise. The psychological insights Harper had taught him proved invaluable for gathering intelligence and avoiding traps that had been specifically designed to exploit military assumptions about civilian behavior. Peterson used his demolitions expertise to create diversions and false trails that led enemy surveillance teams away from the team's actual objectives. Instead of destroying things, he manipulated the environment to support deception operations that kept their enemies guessing about their true capabilities and intentions. The mission progressed unlike any operation the team had ever conducted. Instead of overwhelming their enemies with superior force and technology, they outmaneuvered them through superior adaptability and unpredictability. Every time the hostile forces tried to counter their actions using prepared responses to conventional SEAL tactics, Team 7 shifted to completely different approaches that invalidated their enemies' preparations. The breakthrough came when Williams identified the target through behavioral analysis techniques that Harper had taught him. The high-value individual was hiding among a group of civilians, confident that American soldiers would never be able to distinguish him from innocent bystanders without sophisticated intelligence support that wasn't available for this mission. However, Williams had learned to read subtle indicators of stress, training, and situational awareness that revealed which individuals in the crowd had military or intelligence backgrounds. The target's unconscious behaviors and reactions marked him as clearly as if he had been wearing a uniform. Once Williams knew what to look for, the capture operation itself required the team to abandon every conventional procedure for apprehending targets in urban environments. Instead of using overwhelming force to isolate and secure their objective, they employed subtle manipulation and misdirection, techniques that caused the target to separate himself from his protective network. Voluntarily, Rodriguez used his newfound skills in social engineering to create a situation where the target felt compelled to move to a more vulnerable location. Thompson manipulated the local communication networks to feed false information that supported the deception. Davis provided security through methods that were completely invisible to counter-surveillance teams that were watching for conventional sniper activity. The entire operation was completed without a single shot being fired and without alerting the enemy support network to what had happened. From their perspective, their protected individual had simply walked away and disappeared, leaving no trace of American military involvement. It was the type of surgical precision that conventional tactics could never have achieved in such a complex environment. As Team 7 extracted from the operational area, Mitchell reflected on how much they had changed since their humbling encounter with Harper. They were no longer the predictable, overwhelmingly superior force they had once been. Instead, they had become something much more dangerous, an unpredictable, adaptive unit that could outthink enemies who believed they understood American military capabilities. The success of the mission validated Harper's training methods and proved that elite military units could adapt to face unconventional threats. Team 7 had learned that true superiority came not from following established procedures, but from the ability to abandon those procedures when they became liabilities. They had discovered that the most dangerous enemies were often those who appeared weakest on paper but who understood their opponents better than their opponents understood themselves. Harper's final lesson had been the most important one of all, that the moment any military unit became convinced of its own invincibility was the moment it became most vulnerable to defeat. Team 7 had learned humility, adaptability, and the crucial understanding that their greatest strength lay not in their weapons or training but in their willingness to constantly evolve and improve. The SEAL team that returned from the mission was fundamentally different from the one that had entered Harper's training program. They had retained all of their technical skills and physical capabilities, but they had gained something far more valuable: the wisdom to know when those capabilities were sufficient and when they needed to think in completely different ways. They had learned that sometimes the best way to be unstoppable was to accept that anyone could be stopped, and to prepare accordingly.